Okay, so just getting into things now. I've put up the slide looking back to see the future. You might think that sounds a bit odd. Why am I doing that? And the reason I've done that is because I've worked in the area of sustainability probably now for about 15 years. And what intrigued me when preparing for the webinar and around this topic is that there seemed to have been a kind of rise in information and discussions around sustainability that seemed to be gathering momentum, and then I think just seemed to stop in many ways. And I asked myself, why are we not talking more about compliance as part of sustainable development agenda? And why are we not talking more about a governance structure that is also sustainable? And I'm not saying that it isn't being talked about. I'm not saying that there aren't some companies that are leading in this area, and there is certainly research around the issues. But I am surprised that we are not seeing more sustained conversation around this. And of course, that also lends itself to the question about whether sustainability legal compliance is a concern and why should it be a concern. So the next few slides really just pick up on some of the factors that I think are really influencing the way that companies are having to consider compliance and their responses to it. So you'll see in the slide that I've talked about the fact that the landscape of managing a business responsibly is changing. And what we are seeing is more regulation, the greater impact on, from reputational impacts on brands and their strategies. We see increase in understanding and trying to get to grips with managing risk. We have the constant problem of business costs being squeezed, which then lends itself to exploitation in the supply chain, and of course then how one manages these is a mega trend. And we're also beginning to see a rise in mainstream investors recognizing what we call ESG, or environmental social governance, as a critical differentiator. I think it's also important to understand the kind of era that we're living in and how this has an impact on the importance of sustainability, compliance, and governance. Because what we're seeing is, of course, this rise in transparency. We are seeing increases in litigation, class actions around companies that don't behave properly, the growth in social media, and a trickle of consumer-facing hunger for information that's also increasing. And so that then brings us to the question of, so looking at, you know, these enormous trends and the impact they're having, and asking ourselves, well, what is sustainability legal compliance, and what do we need to do about it? And I should say that there isn't a legal definition of sustainable legal compliance. I think that when one puts the two things together, when we talk about sustainability legal compliance, what I've done is kind of unpick what that means. And what we have is, in fact, a mixture of two different concepts. The one is about an accepted framework of principles around integrity and resilience, transparency, those kind of principles that can influence a way a business operates and a society is governed. And then the other way, we have this question of compliance, so the actual act of obeying an order or a rule or a request. So sustainable legal compliance isn't something that, as I said, is, you know, an easily found legal definition, and nor is it something that just sits in, I think, in respect of just a compliance issue. It also brings into this broader concept of principles around integrity and resilience. And if you feel that that's something that perhaps is worth being challenged on, then please do, because I think that part of having these kind of discussions and webinars is really to unpick the concepts and to make them real, and to consider whether or not we're all looking at things from the same lens. So what actually drives compliance? Now, for those of you who are compliance managers or managers of your environmental systems, lawyers, what you'll be acutely aware of is that risk underpins and risk management underpins a real drive towards compliance. We also see that compliance becomes an issue if you have a management system, so an environment management system or a sustainability management system, where if the system is being audited, a third-party auditor will require that the company can demonstrate its legal compliance. Compliance can also be driven by the idea or the opportunities of change and creating efficiencies, and moves towards best practice. So looking at using compliance as a benchmark, but building your practices in your business in a sense to fit best practice. And again, we see that investor interest is another factor in driving compliance. So another poll that I will ask at the end of the slide is whether or not those of you who are listening are actually tracking sustainability compliance, and whether or not any ethical issues are linked to those that tracking mechanism. So what do we mean by sustainable governance? And again, it might not surprise you, we can't go to a readily found legal definition that we can use and refer back to. So I've pulled out a definition from the IFC saying it is good governance, the rules and practices that govern the relationship between managers and shareholders of corporations, as well as stakeholders. And I hope that most of you listening are familiar with those terms. And if you're not, just ask me at the end what we mean by stakeholders. And the other aspect I've included in this definition of sustainable governance is the fact that it's really about a company operating in an economically, socially, and environmentally friendly manner. So what are some of the benefits of sustainable governance? Oh, there we go. We see that there is strong evidence that companies with sound sustainability governance financially outperform the others, and this is growing. There is a lot more information around this kind of evidence than might have been available 10 years previously. And in fact, we've just pulled together a business case on sustainability, and we'll be releasing that in the next month. So Damo can perhaps just, we can give him the information to link to if that's something of interest, and perhaps worth noting in an email to him if you'd like to see that document. So these are some figures: $650 million in incremental market capitalization per company. That's the kind of benefit that companies are gaining by ensuring that their governance structure is sustainable. And we've also seen that there's no meaningful declines in share price in companies with strong CSR reputations. Now, that's in itself quite an interesting point, because I've been doing some research around the impact of modern slavery issues on companies and their share prices, and it is interesting that in the UK particularly, we've had Sports Direct in the news probably on a weekly basis about their poor governance, and particularly more recently about the fact that in one of their warehouses in the UK, a gang or a group of Eastern Europeans had been trafficked in and were working as slaves. The two brothers who were running the operation were prosecuted and they've gone to jail. But what is really interesting is that subsequently there's been an 11% decline in Sports Direct's share price. So I think that's a really useful practical example to throw into the mix in this conversation. So would you see compliance as part of governance? And I think that most people would agree that respecting the law is a basic premise for a company to behave responsibly. And what we are also seeing is that a number of companies are beginning to look at how they operate beyond just the lens of risk as such. And an example, again, might be of that is to consider, if we're not just looking at things from a risk perspective, but what is the right thing to do, or what is doing the right thing mean, and what impact positively would that have on my business. And then we're seeing that respecting the principles of sustainable development and ensuring sustainability compliance in business operations and supply chains is really a baseline for sustainable governance. Now, I said at the beginning of the talk that we would probably look as well at avenues taken by organizations to demonstrate their compliance. And so one of the really common areas of where organizations have to start considering how they demonstrate their compliance might be in the creation of an environmental management system, where one of the key requirements is often that the company will hold a legal register and that they will also demonstrate compliance. I think what I've seen in my own dealings with companies in relation to this is that many of them will have legal registers in place, and the legal registers might hold a host of legislation, but for a lot of companies, whilst they have the legislation and the register in place, they might not actually be able to demonstrate that they are compliant with the requirements of the law, and therefore might fall short of their certification requirements. So an example of that might be that a piece of waste legislation would require that certain in place when the waste is taken off the premises of a property. To demonstrate compliance, the company should actually have valid transfer notes in a record-keeping system, so that they can actually show that the obligations in the legislation are being met. Now, other avenues taken by organizations to demonstrate compliance might be having in-house counsel, and of course, this varies from company to company, the extent or the size of the legal support and what their focus is. By and large, we see that most in-house counsel will have a strong understanding of commercial and contract law. They might not be that familiar with broader issues around sustainability, including environment and human rights. There's definitely a shift that is starting to take place in legal counsel and their approach to these broader governance issues. We are seeing that they're being asked to cover much more in relation to their own remits. And we've certainly seen that as a result of the UK Modern Slavery Act, that when questions of supply chain and managing labour and other issues used to fall only to perhaps a CSR or ethical manager, those conversations have now started to include lawyers because of the requirement that companies produce a statement on their website about how they're tackling these issues. And so I would say that particularly in relation to in-house counsel, that we're going to see a growth in the next 10 years of counsel having to become more au fait with this whole question of sustainability governance and what that entails. So the other avenues taken by organizations to demonstrate compliance might well be having outsourced help, so a consultant or a lawyer helping them to ensure that they are able to identify the laws that apply to them, and B, that they are actually in compliance with those laws. And another avenue might well be that companies are working directly with regulators. Now, some instances they might not have a choice. Certainly in the UK, we've seen a change in the way that a number of the environmental regulations have been drafted and are monitored. There's very much more of an emphasis on companies self-monitoring and keeping evidence of what they find, and then working with the regulators around any non-compliance issues. So what should companies be doing to ensure that they are legally compliant? Now, I've suggested that undertaking a legal audit might be a good way to start. And what I mean by that is really just, in the first instance, asking what or who is in charge of the legal compliance in a company, and what areas are they covering. So typically, if we talk about sustainability legal compliance, what I'd be expecting organizations to look at is not only environmental and health and safety issues, but also issues around social or employment issues, and then around governance and economic issues. So looking at not only things like corporate manslaughter and bribery, but other issues like managing your data properly, looking at cookies, looking at privacy, looking at reporting requirements. So the benefit, I think, of undertaking this kind of a legal audit is that it should flush out what gaps there are and help organizations to think about where their risks are in relation to those gaps. And that might sound trivial, but we worked with an organization a number of years ago and did this kind of exercise and discovered that one of the things that they were doing as an operational practice, and actually, which ironically was meant to be a charitable benefit, was in completely contrary to the law. And we had very sort of 2 months prior to this, I started seeing a number of other organisations being fined up to £250,000 for breaching this particular piece of legislation. So the legal audit flushed that out, and what the organisation then had to do is actually unpick how it was managing this particular issue. It had to set out some different policies and as to how in the future things would be managed, and then rework it. So there are real benefits, because potentially you could stop fines of quite large amounts being factored against the company. Now, the other thing I've said is that the personnel that you put in charge should really have the appropriate knowledge and support. And this sounds really ridiculous, but I can't tell you how many times I've had people call me up who have absolutely no understanding of the law or the interpretation, and have been put in charge of managing a company's legal register and demonstrating compliance for their management systems. I would say that, if you have somebody that's really interested and able, because often companies have very able people within their remit, is to look at the opportunities of either getting them to train or have some learning around or support around how they can build up appropriate systems. And then I've suggested the creation of a legal register. And the reason I've said that, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail of that in a minute, is that having something that is centrally available for an organization is really key to be able to actually manage compliance efficiently, but also to demonstrate compliance. And I think this also came up in a briefing I did in South Africa and Johannesburg a few years ago, where we were talking about the changes that were being brought to ISO 14001. And when organizations are looking to sell or even acquire a business, lawyers will probably be involved in the due diligence process, checking what's there and what's not there. And of course, if the legal compliance issues are all held centrally, and it's really easy to demonstrate how the company is behaving under or the umbrella of that register, that makes everything simpler when you are dealing with a merger or acquisition, and in fact, actually, when you're dealing with regulators, because what that stops is people having to faff around in different departments trying to find the relevant piece of paper that the actual regulator is looking for. And I would also suggest that you create a process for maintaining compliance. So it's all good and well for a company to set up some kind of legal compliance structure and go, bells blazing in the first year, finding out what applies, dealing with that, but then simply forgetting to maintain compliance. And so understanding that maintaining compliance is critical to being able to demonstrate compliance on an ongoing fashion means the company should think about what kind of process is needed to maintain compliance and perhaps even document that process. So we've spoken about this briefly before. I just really wanted to emphasize the point about who should manage legal compliance in an organization. I think the key things are someone who's able and capable of analyzing legislation. Also, someone who's able to understand whether the company is compliant or not. So that means really having a proper understanding of the business as a whole and what is required to meet its compliance. And that might mean that actually the person in charge might just have to have the skill set to know who else to ask or approach in the business to help them figure out what's needed to be compliant. And a good example of that is, of course, you know, being compliant with human resources issues doesn't often perhaps fall to a sustainability manager, but they should at least have the skill set and to know who to talk to and how to get the right information to demonstrate compliance. And it should also be someone who understands the organization's systems and processes to ensure that control procedures are in place and are integrated, and understand what evidence is needed to demonstrate compliance. And this might mean having to get some help around that as an issue. So demonstrating legal compliance, this means identifying what the obligations are, understanding the context of the organization and how the compliance obligations apply, also identifying who are stakeholders in that compliance exercise, and maintaining documented information of compliance obligations. So I've mentioned this a few times, that legal compliance is a feature of ISO 14001 and 2012-1. And I've just set out this, one of the differences between 2012-1 and 14001 is that 2012-1 captures sustainability as a concept for compliance. So it goes beyond what ISO 14001 requires. It goes beyond environment, and it covers social and governance issues as well. And really, the reason, so what I said about using ISO as a case study is that in 2015, I think it was, that we did some work on what the return of investment was on sustainability management systems in the sports sector. And the report's available on my website. The reason we did this is because we were interested in seeing whether companies were managing their return of investment on sustainability, and also what the impact with legislation was on that. So there's there's some interesting findings in there. I think one of the things that I would say about sustainability legal compliance and return of investment is that if it is properly tracked, it could be quite interesting seeing the kind of actions that are taken to avoid being fined or having even a reputational impact as a means of measuring that return of investment. Now, I wanted to just add this point in, because I think that ensuring that you work with a legal register that is effective is really critical, if that's one of the routes that you as an audience might feel is something that you want to do. And I think that what I've seen why legal registers can be totally ineffective is because some of them are not properly completed in the first place. So this point really goes to those companies who set up a master legal register on an Excel spreadsheet run by the manager who's been given the task of doing this horrible job, and who may or may not have an idea of what the laws are. I think this is particularly where having online registers become far more effective, because you should be working with experts who are gathering together the legislation that might apply to your company and creating a central repository online to be able to actually access that. So I've seen it fail because, as I said, people tasked with completing it aren't trained. It may not be used during the preparation of the operating procedures. It may not identify key requirements of the regulation, and it can just be swamped with superfluous. It should have superfluous information on my slide, sorry. So what I've seen from that is that some legal registers, some online ones, I would say as well, have a list of laws that apply, but then in the actual description of the law have such long summaries. To be honest, it might have been easier just to go back to the source of the law and try and do it yourself. So I know that certainly with Libro, that is one of the things that we're working hard on, is that all the summaries are set out in easy, understandable language. And that does bring me to the question about how Legaltech can advance sustainability. And these, I think, are some of the really pertinent points that we can see a reduction in costs by improving processes. I've seen this working with a sustainability registered legal toolkit that I have worked with lots of companies, and actually by centralizing the system, we see a reduction of duplication and processes. We also see more we have a centralized system which is more visible and therefore more accessible as well. And of course, that in itself can advance sustainability governance. So I'm not going to talk that much about a sustainability legal register, only to say that having one in place is, again, one of those things that can help identify gaps in compliance. It can bring together a central compliance function. It can be used as a form of stakeholder engagement because of the fact that lots of people in an organization might have to actually contribute it. And as I've said before, it's really critical to try and measure return of investment when one is in place. And so what we see when companies start tackling sustainability, legal compliance and governance in a more strategic fashion, where it's not just a tick box exercise, we see that we have a move towards best practice, where we have reputation, strategic interests, and opportunity-led issues being critical, as opposed to it just being risk-led and tick box exercise. So just going to the point on monitoring before I think I'm nearing the end of what I wanted to share with you, is that I had, excuse me, mentioned that I think it's really critical to determine the frequency of reporting. And this comes down to understanding the complexity of activities and products that are covered by your legal registers or your sustainability governance system. Also understanding the consequences of legal non-compliance, and excuse me, and really having in place a monitoring system that will start also picking up trends of non-compliance, so that I'm so sorry, so that you are able to look at the strength of your operational controls. And then just a word about management systems is that very often they will also have a requirement that they are that the registers are managed periodically. Sorry. So where are we going to? I think that in reality, when one looks at starting to engage with this question of sustainability governance and sustainability legal compliance, we do need some bold new steps, because it is something of a model that doesn't require silo thinking. It's about integrating stakeholder engagement across a business. It's about ensuring that your compliance and your CSR teams work together to embed ethical behavior and sustainable governance, where they might in the past have just worked in silos. And then I think critically, for those of you listening, what actions can you take? What can you take away from today as a step in the direction of perhaps helping to contribute to making your business more sustainable?